My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today, I'm going to talk about how your life would go on even if a bad thing happened. And I had a post about this not so long ago, and it's really a linchpin of successful treatment for anxiety. And I'll discuss this idea, this precept, and kind of understanding catastrophic thinking and how to think differently. And as you know, I like to talk about anxiety. I grew up in an anxious home myself, and so then it's always been something that I've really been interested in helping people with. Before that, please do subscribe. My most recent subscriber episode was Her Lack of Desire Isn't Usually About You, but sometimes it is. Okay, so the things that clients usually get upset about happening, and they think that they would not be able to deal with it. They think these things would create intolerable amounts of negative emotions. They would be devastated. It would be like what I call like this last page in the comic book, you know, like where something bad happens and the person's mouth is open and they're grabbing their cheeks and they're just wrought with devastation, and you just know they will never recover, ever. That is a comic book. That is a fairy story. That isn't real. But if you were raised in an anxious house, you think that it is. So questions people have is like, what would I do if my partner cheated on me? What would I do if my partner left me? What would I do if my partner died? What about my child? What if my child got sick or died? What if I was no longer attractive to my partner? They were no longer attracted to me, and nobody was. I'm much less physically attractive in theory, and nobody responds to me anymore. What if I die earlier than expected? What if I lose my job? Things like that. So if you grew up in a very, very dramatic house, and you may not think of it as dramatic, but if people were always talking in these tragic tones about shit that happened, this is why I have a post called Being Made to Listen to Your Parents' Sad Stories is Abuse. It's emotional abuse. So you could have had stories like where people are like, it all changed after my father lost his job. That's when my mother became an alcoholic. And that's why my brother took to drugs. You know, and if my father hadn't lost his job, none of that would have happened. And so then you grow up and you're like, oh my God, if I lose my job, my entire family will be destroyed. Everything terrible will happen. It will all be from that moment. Or for example, a mother who teaches her daughter, I got pregnant. I got pregnant too young, and that was the problem. That's why I never got my degree. That's why we have to live like this. That's why we don't have any money. Never get pregnant. So this girl that's listening is going to be terrified to have sex, obviously. And if it's a boy that's listening, he's going to be terrified to have sex too, because he's going to ruin somebody's life if she gets pregnant, right? Or there's so many women that grow up in families where they have somewhat of a narcissistic or a very narcissistic mother or aunt or somebody that just cannot deal with aging. And aging is the worst thing. And they're constantly trying to act younger and be younger, kind of like the mother in The Glass Menagerie, one of my favorite things to quote, my favorite play. So if you know what I'm talking about, then it's like her, who was always talking about how many gentlemen callers she had and basically traumatized her daughter because her daughter could never be like her. But anyway, people that are obsessed with losing their youth, right? This is something. Or somebody who lost a sibling. If you lose a sibling and you feel like then your parents never recovered, and before that they were normal, guess what? They weren't. And then after that, they weren't, you know? And I say guess what? They weren't because, as I'll discuss, people do actually recover from the loss of a child. They're never the same, right? I mean, obviously it's a hugely devastating thing, but most people, when they have other children, can recover somewhat. You know, and if that's like the end of you and you go to bed for the rest of your life, that's an unusual very unusual situation, right? That would mean it was depression and all sorts of bad things, not grief, not only grief, right? Grief could be the precipitator. But the point being, okay, so then let's go through these things. And sometimes people are very surprised when I talk about this. So let's go the guy that's scared that his wife's going to leave him. All right, so what if she left you? He's like, well, nah, that would be intolerable. I'm in love with her. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I wouldn't ever be able to recover. I would be so poor too. And, I see on the internet all these guys living under the bridge and their wife is driving a Lexus and, and also the children would be lost to me somehow. And also I would never meet another woman because I'm not very wonderful myself. Of course, you see the key there is a terrible self-esteem. And we walk through it and I'm like, you would be made in the shade, honestly. No offense to your wife. She seems fine, whatever. We'll talk about your relationship. All the divorced guys I know, they're dating like it's like shooting fish in a barrel, honestly. If they're even a reasonable human being at all, which they all are if they go to therapy. Honestly, therapy is very attractive to women in today's dating market. And because it means the guy works on himself. You get 50-50 custody or something like it if you want it. That's how it is in today's day and age. The judge will give it unless something really bad is going on with you. You'll get custody of your children. And the truth is that if she left you, you wouldn't think about her the same way. You would think about the bad sides of her. You'd be actually pretty angry. And anger is a mobilizing emotion, and it's empowering. There's a reason that there's like the divorce diet and stuff. People drop a lot of weight. They have a glow up. They're fueled by adrenaline. It's like being on meth after you get divorced. And guys have a strong sex drive and they start dating pretty quick. And, Dorothy Parker quote, the fastest way to get over somebody is get under somebody else. And that's true for both genders. And that's what would happen. And you would see the kids less than you do now. But when you saw them, she wouldn't be up your ass about how badly you're parenting them. And the statistics show, honestly, that guys make more money after a divorce because they're mobilized. And I know this myself. I made more money after my divorce. You're really, really motivated to make more money, especially if you're in a situation where now you have more time. You can make more time. You could have more time. You make more money. But for a lot of people. So the point is either way, even if you didn't make more money, even if you felt that your alimony was unfair, 100%. Let me go back. No, not 100. I've been in practice 15 years. I got to do a quick, I'm scanning. And I think, I honestly think every guy that I've worked with has ended up at least having sex after his divorce if he wants to. I mean, it's not hard to do, people have a desire to bond. But anyway, and I mean by that, the women on the internet, on the dating apps have a desire to bond. You're in therapy, you're working on yourself, you got your kids, you seem like a nice dude, And so I say this stuff and the guy, it's like, to get back to the main point, which wasn't just this, I have podcasts just about this though. But the point is, they're like kind of sober. It's like it's like they're like almost were drunk on the hysterical tragedy that they were making up in their head, which always goes along with growing up in a house where there's anxious, catastrophic statements like the ones I described earlier. And so the guy learns those, right? He learns that style of thinking. And it's almost like he wakes up out of a fog and he's like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess, I don't want to get divorced though. I guess not yet. I want to work on the relationship, work on myself. I say, great. But you got to be in a relationship because it's a choice, not out of fear and being trapped and thinking somehow your life would be destroyed in some ridiculous Greek tragedy sense, that isn't real if she left you. Because how can you be a good partner? Then that's fucking Stockholm syndrome. She's basically your captor then because you don't think you could leave. So you got to love your captor. Can't be like that, right? To be in a loving, healthy relationship, to feel like it's fun and free and that you're being your best self. It can't be Stockholm syndrome. So let's for real think about what it would be like. As I have a podcast on, nobody regrets their divorce. Barely anybody I've ever met regrets their divorce. Certainly nobody in therapy, right? So point being, life would go on. Now let's take even the worst one in the world, like the very, very worst thing. The child dies. It's the worst possible. You took your child somewhere, they get sick, so it's then got to be your fault, right? This is how an anxious person would think. Of course, it's not your fault, obviously. Or like you got into a car crash, let's say. This is something anxious women think about a lot. You crash the car and your child dies. Well, I mean, how could you get over that? That's the end screen. That's you in the Edward Munch, the Scream painting. And that's it. That would be the rest of your life. You would no longer be a sentient human. Yes, you would. First of all, statistically, it's likely you have other children, and you would have to be there for them. And also, people bounce back from things, and then they could shape their life around this terrible tragedy. So many people, it's like something like that happens. Of course, it's devastating. It's horrible. I've worked with people who have lost children. It's horrible. It's the worst thing. It's the most stressful thing, according to those studies of the stressful things. It's the most horrible thing. But you know what? People get through it. They get out to the other side of it. And then usually they recreate their life to be more meaningful. And it goes in a different direction. So, for example, now they're going to work at some sort of a, in a different occupation, like my profession, like maybe they become a therapist for people who lost their children, or they would have a support group. That would be the life that they had. Or, they would decide that life is fleeting, so they're going to take off and spend more time with their other children, or whatever the case may be, right? Would their marriage probably survive it? Statistics say unlikely. But you know what? At that point, that becomes less important than it did before, because the worst thing has happened to you. So sometimes people grow in different ways after that happens, and they remarry, or they don't remarry, but they don't stay together. But some people do stay together, and their relationship is strengthened by the bond that they have that nobody else can understand. Either way, you see my point. This is an objective scenario. This happens. It happens to people. It happens to people, and they come out the other side. Now, if you grew up in a home where people were constantly talking about tragic events as inflection points that ended up catastrophic, then of course you're going to think about everything like that. If you grew up in a home, though, where people spoke differently about things. So, for example, I saw Esther Perel, Mating in Captivity, State of Affairs, the author of those, and other books, I believe, but I can't think of them right now. Point being, she had parents who were Holocaust survivors, and she spoke about this at whatever psychology convention I was at. And she said there's two kinds of people who survive the Holocaust. And I'm Jewish, so I've spoken to a lot of children of Holocaust survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And she said there's two kinds of people. The people that then they never trust the world again, and they're paranoid and depressed always because they've seen the worst of humanity. And they're just basically always think that something will go wrong and you can't trust anybody, etc. And there's people, which she said her parents were more of those people, who decide to live life, grab life by the horns, live life to the fullest, because they're so appreciative that they survived and they got a second chance at life, and they're never going to waste any life. So this is a terrible calamity, tragedy that happens, and people think of it differently. So if you grew up with her kind of parents, then you become a very different kind of person, a more successful person if she's any sort of indicator, and a happier person. Then, not that I know her personally, but, just how she seems to be a fairly happy, successful person. Who knows, though? Definitely successful. But the point is that had she had parents who were very negative and depressive, it's unlikely that she would have had that sort of attitude as she does now. She would have had their sort of attitude, which is like a very negative, paralyzed. I have a post, how growing up in a negative home paralyzes you in adulthood. So she would probably grow up like that, right? And you wouldn't have heard of her, and neither would I, and we wouldn't be having this conversation about her. But the point being is that no matter what happens, you can choose how to view it. And if you grew up hearing that the worst thing in the world happened to somebody you know or somebody in the family, and then they were never the same again and they never recovered, then you have this whole never recovered rhetoric in your mind. And whenever anything bad happens, you think of the idea of never recovering. And then there's other people who say things like, I got pregnant early, so then, I couldn't get my degree. Going back to the previous example of the mother who says, I got pregnant early, so basically that's why we're poor. And then there's a mother who says, I got pregnant early, so then when you were about 4 is when I decided to get my bachelor's at night. And you remember, that's when you stayed with the neighbor twice a week. Maybe you remember. And that's why now I'm an accountant and blah, 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 or whatever. So that person has a very, very different perspective. Oh, there's windows, they open, but they don't fully close. There could be another window that opens later on. And if you're smart and you're adaptive, then you can make sense of how to fix something that didn't go well the first time. It isn't just a catastrophic end point, but rather an inflection point at which your life can change direction, but it can still be a good life. So if you hear stories like that, and this can be motivating to you to think, what stories do I tell my children about bad things that happened to me and in my life and in my family? Because let's say your parent was an alcoholic. So many people say, my mother was an alcoholic, so, that's why basically my brother's an alcoholic, and that just is what it is, and it was terrible. Or it could be, my mother was an alcoholic, she didn't get help. My brother, he's back and forth. Sometimes he goes to AA, sometimes he doesn't. I have hope, honestly, that both of them at some point may stop drinking, especially my brother, who I have seen quit, for some length of time. And that's, when he comes to more family events and stuff. And life is long. And I honestly hope that both of them eventually get treated and get the help that they deserve, shit happens. Life isn't perfect. Also, life is long. You never know what could happen. And I hope for the best with these people. And I have some faith that maybe something good could happen in the future. Versus the people that are like, we don't talk to grandma and we don't talk to Uncle Jim because they're alcoholics. And this destroyed my life. And so therefore they're very selfish people. And therefore we don't talk to them, And that's a very, very different. Now, whether or not you end up talking to your mom or Uncle Jim or whatever is different. And I talk about these ideas, and I have podcasts about whether to go low contact or no contact, or I have the post grandparents don't really mess up grandkids, which always makes people uncomfortable. So then they, say, oh no, that's impossible. By the way, just as a parenthetical, that's exactly the type of thinking that I'm talking about and decrying in this exact episode. The idea that there's a cutoff point, and nobody can change, and there's no possible way that your mother, who was narcissistic and a bitch with you, could possibly be a better grandmother. That's the end point, the catastrophic thinking. People that are healthier, and they, believe me, have to really try hard to be healthy if the mother was narcissistic, but that's what therapy is for, right? And so they could say, you know what? My mother is kind of a shit mother, but she seems to be okay as a grandmother in small amounts. So, we'll see what we see. My kids don't really take her shit personally, even when she says some weird shit. And, we see her a couple times a year. That, to me, I've heard so many adult children. By the way, when you're on a different side of history, it's different, because a lot of adult children are like, my crazy parents had problems with everybody, and so that's why I didn't know my grandmother or my aunt. Remember, it doesn't always go how you think it's going to go, where they're like, oh, thank God my mother saved me from knowing other family members. I almost never hear that unless it's cases of profound abuse, neglect, etc. Then they're like, okay, I understand why we don't see these people. But usually they say, my mother or my father have problems with everybody, including that whole side of the family. So that's how it goes down in history, by the way, later. So that could just be an eye-opener worth the price of admission in and of itself. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I do have a post about it, and I'll link to that in the description. And I'll talk to you all soon, and have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.